Welcome to this month's episode of Short Clip Case Studies, brought to you by Performance Solutions.
Thanks for the invitation to share this case study. We're going to be looking at an in-season acceleration development program for an under-18 soccer player. So the overview will go into the background, some baseline data, the global program, the specific intervention, and the results that we got, as well as a summary of what we learned. So in terms of the background, the player was an under-18 soccer player, played in centre midfield. He was an athlete that competed at various levels of competition, playing at under-18 at school and academy, and then he also played some games at a senior level. There were periods of the year where there were very high volumes of games, often 2 to 3 per week. Type of player that he was meant that he put in a very high work rate in every game, and that came at a cost at certain times, impacting on some of the work that we could do and how he sort of fared in terms of fatigue. So in terms of baseline data, we were dealing with a mature athlete post-PHV, 177 centimetres tall, 75 kilograms approximately. And in terms of his baseline data around some general physical qualities, great aerobic engine, up over 5 meters per second in the maximum aerobic speed test. Pretty strong for a soccer player, getting close to that 1.5 times body weight marker that we would typically be chasing with this type of athlete, and then look to move them beyond, obviously, longer term. Decent CMJ for the type of athlete that he was, in terms of very aerobic animal. As much as compared to the others, he didn't excel. We had other boys within the group with CMJs up over 60 centimetres. This is CMJ with an arm swing, by the way. But where we could see that he was lacking was in terms of acceleration. The quickest boys that we had, rugby players, were able to run 2.8 something, but he was back out over 3 seconds. 3:07 was his best time. But as I said, when he was in high volumes of games, the fatigue would mean that was a little bit worse, out to sort of as far as 3.15 for a 20-metre sprint. So we wanted to make an intervention to improve this. So the intervention that we put in place was a very heavy sled protocol. I came across this research by JB Moran, and I'd seen that it had been effective with similar players, albeit they were a little bit older, and the protocol that he put in place was a little bit heavier and consistently heavier at 2 times 80%. So being that the athlete was a little bit younger, I took this down slightly, but I also wanted to make sure that it wasn't all just slow. I wanted him to have different, experience different velocities under the towing load. So we went with, all of these were 20-metre sprints. We did 2 20-metre sprints at 75% of body weight on the sled, 2 at 50%, 2 at 25%, and then 2 20-metre unresisted accelerations to make sure that we were still getting a high velocity exposure and exposure to the skill of accelerating itself. So in terms of how that fits in with his weekly program, we'd get, on a 1-game week, we would do 2 very heavy sled sessions, Tuesday and Thursday, either side of training on a Wednesday, and then we'd leave enough room at the back end of the week for him to have a day of recovery before he played. In a 2-game week, where there was a game on a Wednesday and a Sunday, we would typically only do the unresisted accelerations on the Tuesday, pretty low volume, sort of 3 to 4 in the session, and we'd save the very heavy sled session then for later in the week, on the Friday, when we knew he didn't have a game on the Saturday, so we would get the stimulus still in there. This was all supported as well by an integrated approach to strength and power development alongside it. But what we did, because it was in season, we kept that strength work at a low volume, and we made sure there was low velocity loss, under 10% velocity loss in his working sets on strength work. And then close to games, we would, so the Tuesday session, we'd make sure there was no velocity loss. We'd have the bars moving quickly, around 0.55 to 0.6 meters per second. So it was in that sort of 70 to 80% intensity range. So we won't accumulate a lot of fatigue. In terms of the session design itself, we would go through a ramp warm-up with some sprinting drills. We would have The key things for him were we were trying to focus on sort of his posture, his head control, in terms of his leg action. We were looking at him switching and pushing and being able to project his centre of mass. The faults really for him in his acceleration were really, there was some technical issues where he interpreted frequency in the initial steps as being fast. So part of what we were trying to correct with his technical work was this. And obviously with the sled intervention as well. His arm actions were fairly short, so we were looking at big split actions between the arms. So then we had our speed protocol, a couple of minutes, 3 minutes recovery between the sprints that he was doing there, and then our strength and power work, all pretty low volume. Cleans were done in cluster sets to keep minimize the velocity loss. And as I said, we had our target bar speeds at relatively slightly lower intensities than we would for maximal strength work. So what was the outcome of this? So the aim was obviously to improve the athlete's acceleration. 20-meter sprint time was our measure. We started out with a PB on the 20-meter of 3.07 seconds, and after the intervention, the guy PB'd with a 2.91 second 20-meter sprint. So we were really happy with the outcome of the intervention. Saw a marked difference in his technique in the acceleration phase. The sled was really useful in teaching him to push and getting him out of this habit of this high frequency, the high frequency of turnover of his legs in these initial steps, which he perceived as being fast, and he really learned to project and push. We saw much better lean angle for him coming out in that acceleration as well. So it turned out for us to be a really great tool. What lessons did we learn? So we learned that for this athlete, it was an effective tool to improve his acceleration. As much as there was a physical stimulus, I think for this guy, it turned out to be a really good teaching strategy for him, for someone who interpreted frequency as being fast. It taught him how to push for longer and to get a feel for that with the sled was much better than just us simply cueing him. So I've been coaching him in terms of speed work for a couple of years. We'd got him relatively stronger. He was in decent power, but getting him to understand how to push and project was something that, despite all the cues in the world, we hadn't managed to really get him to nail down. But the sled did that teaching for us. I think that was an important lesson. But on the flip side of it, we also had athletes that were in the same training group, but we applied the methodology to, and it wasn't effective. And I think what this comes down to possibly is just the type of athlete and how they do what they do in sprinting and accelerating. So for the guy in the case study, he was quite a concentric athlete. He liked time on the ground. His counter movement jump and standing long jump were things that he was pretty decent at. But the more reactive, elastic type jumps were something that he struggled with to get in terms of getting off the ground. Liked deep squat positions, liked deep angles of in his acceleration. That was particularly obvious once we'd done the sled work as well. This other guy was more of an elastic type athlete, and despite the one guy getting faster, this guy actually got slower. He really excelled. He was really elastic and bouncy once he got out over 15, 20 meters. So we thought with this intervention for him, like we could maybe take him from the low 2.8s that he was already running down to the 2.7s. But that didn't really work out. He ended up getting a little bit slower. It just disrupted what he was good at, I think. It's not to say he wouldn't benefit from resisted work in terms of improving his acceleration positions, but I think it was just too heavy for him at this time. Other challenges with the implementation were using the sleds in the UK where it was raining. There was reduced friction on the grass, so sometimes our body weight loads weren't weren't having the effect that we wanted. So we had to overload those sleds a little bit more to get the same kind of stimulus. And another factor was like these boys were coming out and training when they started some of their reps in without studded footwear. there were problems. They were slipping and we weren't getting the traction that we needed, particularly for the heavier sets. So we made sure then that every session they came with studded boots to make sure that we could train effectively with the heavier sleds in the weather conditions that we had. And another thing I'd say is we were limited to 2 sleds. If you've got the budget or facilities already to have multiple sleds, it makes it much more easier to work with this type of thing in a group setting. Hopefully you've enjoyed that case study. Thanks again, Alex, for the opportunity to present. And if you have any questions, feel free to use my contact info here, and I'll happily dive in a bit deeper on this particular topic.